passage because it's in some senses uncharacteristic of the way Paul writes elsewhere. He wrote that in about 50 AD, about 20 years after Jesus had died and risen. So this is a time when there were still hundreds and hundreds of people who knew Jesus, and they were witnesses to the things that Jesus had done. And the church was in its first stage of growth. There were small churches about our size, I would say. I would say the Corinthian church would be about as big as us, maybe a bit bigger, maybe up to 50, 60, I would guess. We don't know. But it was a very successful church in the sense that it was wealthy, because later on Paul asked them to give money to other churches elsewhere that were really in serious trouble. But it was also the first charismatic church where people talked in tongues. Other churches didn't do this, but the Corinthians did. But what is interesting about that section that Chris read then is that Paul is talking about the way he actually preached, because Paul was coming away from one of the failures of his missionary activity. He in the weeks before he arrived in Corinth, he'd been in Athens, about 80 miles north along a road, so it took a couple of days to walk from Athens south to Corinth. And when he arrived in Corinth, I suspect he was somewhat shaken by what had happened to him in Athens. And he began to reflect on what was the problem. It was such a difficult business trying to explain what it was that he believed, and this mission that he had to take the gospel, the good news, to the world. And he was called, he said, not to take it to the Jewish community, but he was called to take it to the Gentiles, the Greeks, the Romans, and all the other nationalities that lived in these cities. So what happened in Athens that sort of had him worried? It's very interesting. Athens at this stage was well past its former glory. It was really just a large provincial town. There were other cities like Alexandria, the much more interesting and diverse as an intellectual sort of community. Even Antioch had a university much bigger than what was going on in Athens. Athens still had the reputation of being a place of learning and great culture and so forth. But there was a sort of arrogance about Athens. And when he arrived in Athens, as was his custom, he went straight to the local synagogue. And there was a Jewish community in Athens, and it had recently been swelled because Claudius had sent all the Jews from Rome. He had banished the Jewish community out of Rome, and they had to go somewhere, so many of them went to Athens and other places around the Mediterranean. And there was a Jewish community, and he began arguing with them. I would love to have heard those arguments. And he was basically chucked out. So he went into a city square nearby, and he began to take his place in public dialogue, which was a sort of an Athenian custom. If you're a man with or a woman with ideas to try out, then you would take your place in various areas of the city, which were like speakers' corners. And you would get up there and you'd start speaking, and people would gather around, and if over time you proved to be an interesting person, you could gather a little collection around you of people. And this is what Paul was doing. And while he was there talking, some of the leading philosophers heard him, and they began engaging him, and they began a series of spirited conversations. Now, the two schools of philosophy that dominated Athens at the time were the Epicureans and the Stoics. Now those words mean something very different then than what they do today. Epicureanism was not about food or anything like that. It was the Epicureans were not particularly interested in politics. They saw the essential purpose of life was to find a place of stillness within the middle of life. So they said that the problems of life come from the passions. And if you get stirred by things, then you are in danger of falling into excess. So you really kept yourself away from any heavy engagement. So the Epicureans in many ways strike me as extremely boring people. I'm certainly not an Epicurean. I don't mind getting stirred up by things and so forth. For example, the Epicureans they were ambiguous about sex. See, because sex had the effect of stirring you up and creating jealousies and so forth. So if you're going to be a true Epicurean, there was no sex. So I can see many. No, I won't go there. The Stoics, because the Epicureans weren't interested in politics, they didn't have as much influence, and the Stoics did. They were the dominant philosophical strain, and in some ways you could say that the Stoics were like New Age thinkers. They had, what was interesting about the Stoics was that they had a view about God, and they used an argument which we Christians use. One of the classic arguments for establishing whether or not God exists is to look out in the world and say there is order in the world, profound order. There is great complexity, and the complexity is elegant and it is beautiful. So where does that come from? You know, the argument about the watch. Someone who's never seen a watch, someone who's never seen any mechanical devices, in some sort of pre-literate society, comes across a watch on the ground and they pick it up and they see this thing going around, and they look and they say, that is unlike anything I've seen anywhere around us. And if they are thoughtful, they will say, this has been made by somebody. It must have been, because it seems to have no purpose beyond itself except the extraordinarily clever order of the way it operates. So that you say there is movement, which means there is life. There is order, which means there is mind. And so you say, if you look at, therefore, someone has made it. And that is an argument that Christians use about God. If you look at the world, how do you explain the world? Is it simply an arbitrary process? All the beauty of all the various aspects of what happens in the world, are they just things that have happened? There must be some order. Must be some guiding principle. So, they're the two schools that Paul faces. And he gives his talk. They ask him, look, come and talk to us. They don't have a high view of him, actually. They insult him when they invite him. They say, they use a word, the Greek word is spermologos. And it's a word which means, you're a dilettante, you're a babbler. You're a person that just picks little bits out of this and that and that. You know? So we'll listen to you. Come on. Let's hear what you've got to say. They take him to the Areopagus and say, right, go. And he delivers his talk, which you can read in Acts 17. It's one of the great sermons. In fact, for me, the greatest of all the sermons that emerges out of the early Christian church, because it is Paul trying to reach through to the Stoics. He's not talking to the Epicureans, he's talking to the Stoics. You know he is, because he uses their arguments. He quotes their poets. It is a beautifully weighted piece of apologetic. And it has been, in a sense, I think I've told you this before, I studied this at great length because it has formed my own view as to how I relate to the world and how I talk to the world around me. So this is Paul in contact with the great philosophical school and saying, I've got something to say to you. You even have begun to understand yourself. Look inside your own thinking and you'll see the beginnings of the process that will allow you to understand what I'm talking about. But it didn't work. It didn't work because right at the end of his speech, he said this. He said, God has overlooked the age of ignorance, but now he commands men and women everywhere to repent, because he has fixed the day on which he will have the world judged by a man whom he has designated. Of this he has given assurance to all by rising him from the dead. When he said that, they all laughed at him and said, buzz off. This is madness, this is ridiculous. It is nonsense. And off he goes. And a couple of people say, I would like to hear some more from you. But essentially, Paul walked out of Athens, south, over probably 2.5 days, went to Corinth, and left Athens, and we never hear of a church ever being established there. And when he arrives in Corinth, I think he is a changed man. And we hear the intimations of it in what Chris just read to us. The first thing is, he said, the gospel is madness to the world. And he realised that no matter what he did, no matter how cleverly he massaged the content of what he had to say and found bridges across to the thinking of the people he was talking to, in the end, he realised that no one would believe him. He said the Greeks are about philosophy. They want coherence. They want stuff that makes sense. They want arguments. Prove to us that God exists. Come on. What are your arguments? That's what they wanted. The Jews, he said, they wanted signs. They wanted miracles. Oh, if you believe in God, show us. Come on, show us something. That's what God, whenever God is in the world, God does miracles. We're yours. And he couldn't produce either of those. And he said to them, and I just want to read you a little section that follows on from what we heard. So it was, my friends, he says, that I came to you without any pretensions to eloquence or wisdom. That's not true. He had great eloquence. I mean, read his speech in Athens. It is a superbly eloquent talk. And he, don't forget, had been schooled, educated at a university level in rhetoric, which was one of the essential ingredients. Anyone who went to university had to study rhetoric, which was the art of persuasion, of talking. All of the aspects of communication were caught up in rhetoric. The way you moved your hands, the gestures you made, the way you stated your arguments, the quality of your voice and all that sort of stuff. And he said, I didn't come, he said, I came to you without any pretensions to eloquence or wisdom in declaring the truth about God. I resolved that while I was with you, I would not claim to know anything but Jesus Christ nailed to the cross. So somehow he's come down to that raw realisation. He said, look, in Athens, I tried to do it this way. I tried to find those arguments. He said, but I realise it's about Christ. And then he goes that next step, nailed to the cross. He couldn't say it in a more offensive way. So he had faced the fact that the essential rock of the gospel came down to that single matter. So he goes to Corinth. Now Corinth is a very interesting place. The Corinth had been wiped out. It was a very important Greek city. And it was on the upper isthmus of the Peloponnese. You know, Greece comes down and there's this funny little isthmus, and then there's a big lump at the bottom of Greece. Corinth is right in that isthmus. So ships coming from this way would come in there to Corinth, and if they wanted to go over here, they had to go all the way around the bottom. And it's like the Panama Canal. If you want to get across the small block of land to the other side of America, you've got to go right down the south. So the Corinthians tried to build, for many, and it wasn't just the Corinthians, for many hundreds of years, people had tried to dig a canal across. It was four miles across. And Julius Caesar, a couple of months before he was murdered, he re-established Corinth and set down in law that it could be filled up with freedmen and Roman army veterans, like a reward for service. And Corinth filled up with people. So Corinth at this stage is only about, the recent Corinth is only about 100 years old, but it is bigger than Athens, probably twice as big as Athens, and it is a rough town. In fact, there was a saying around the time it's called Corintioso. That was like, if you said, what are you doing? Oh, you'd say, oh, Corintioso, which means I'm going out to have sex. It was a town known for bars, nightclubs, sex and money. And in fact, some 50 years later, when a local historian called Szabo wrote about Corinth, he said that the temple of Aphrodite, which was in the city, had 1,000 temple prostitutes. I don't think that's true. I think Szabo got it wrong, but this was the reputation. The prostitutes would work out of the temple, and all the money they earned would go back into the temple, so they made a lot of money. And there was there were famous prostitutes there that would charge you thousands of dollars. And the prestige of going with these women was such. So really, in a sense, nothing much has changed, but that was Corinth. It was like Las Vegas. Paul goes into the middle of this and he says, I'm done with philosophy. I'm coming here to talk to you about Jesus Christ. And that's it. So, this issue is very live for me. Because over the last couple of months, I've been thinking about this. Because I'm writing a book and various other things I'm doing. And I'm in that sense where I am trying to do what Paul was doing, communicate to Australia. And I'm asking myself, what is it that I have got to say? What is the core part of the gospel that I must communicate? And I'm looking for ways to look into Australian society. And in the back of my mind is this bell ringing of Paul turning up in Corinth saying, I want to know only one thing, Christ and Him crucified. And I think, well, that's a pretty... Where do I go after that? So, I think this is the dilemma that the United Church is facing. A lot of churches are facing, in the last 100 years or so, as numbers have declined in Western Christianity, There is a school of thought that says the issue that is central to why the church is losing numbers is because what we are talking about is essentially unacceptable. There are aspects of what the gospel is. The miracles, Jesus walking on water and Jesus rising from the dead. And Jesus being crucified, tortured to death as the central moment of Christianity. When we have communion, the communion is all about this. The words are, every time you eat and drink, you declare the Lord's death until he comes. When we raise the bread, this is the body of Christ, broken for you, tortured for you. And the wine, this is Christ's blood, spilt for you. So that is the central act of worship within the church. It is all about what Paul was talking about. But I notice, and I've been noticing this in the last couple of months when I haven't been preaching so much, and so I listen to people coming in and out of our church preaching, and I notice we almost never talk about Christ and him crucified, because we're looking for that other thing. And so we have changed, in a sense, what the gospel actually is. If I could summarise it, it's difficult to summarise a whole range of sermons into one sort of theme, but in a sense, I think we have decided that the gospel is about the way we behave in the world, our attitudes, having hope, having insight, being prepared to change, being prepared to give, and being prepared to sort of open ourselves and to find encouragement and succour within the life of the gospel. That is part of it. I've no doubts about that. But what do you think Paul would say? And this is what is going around in my mind. I've got to stop. But so I will leave this. This is the dilemma. What is it that we say is the gospel? Is it some idea that makes it a thing of the mind? Or is it to do with a historical reality, namely that Jesus Christ came into the world and he came to die for us, and then he rose again? That, to me, is what it's all about. And I'm trying to find about ways of talking.